Hi guys, Virtus Education here with the 30th episode of the Unreal Development Kit Beginner series. And in this episode I'm going to be going over the visual scripting interface inside of UDK called Kismet. So we've actually played around with a few different visual scripting interfaces inside of UDK already, those being the material editor, and I believe we also did touch up on something else as well, but I can't remember at the moment. So this visual scripting interface is actually used for programming the game if you don't necessarily want to use a hand-coded programming language, Unreal script, which is in the engine. Now, keep in mind you can't necessarily do pretty much everything that you can do in Unreal scripting Kismet, but you sure as hell can do a lot. You can, in fact, make an entire game in Kismet. There's many example projects of that being done, and it's definitely something very powerful and can be used for scripting out events in your level and so on and so forth. So, for example, over here I have a quick script, a very basic script which basically on an event, that event being level when the level loads, this matinee sequence will play. So I'm going to show you what that matinee sequence is. So at the moment I'm in the editor, there's this little box. It's not moving at the moment because the event hasn't happened. However, as soon as the level is loaded and starts to play, it's going to start spinning, and that's just a basic sort of Kismet event Kismet sequence you can do. However, over here, I've also got something which we're going to be doing in this episode, which essentially just says text based on whether or not a ball is set to a certain value. Now, I'm going to be going over all of this stuff, as it may look a little complicated, especially for those of you that haven't done any programming in the past. Having said that, those of you that have done programming in the past, you're going to find this really easy, and the basic principles are pretty much exactly the same, in the sense that you do in fact have your event-driven stuff. So, for example, those events can be level loaded, it can be an input, for example, when the player presses C, A, W, 1, 2, 3, etc, etc. You also have your variables, the most important ones, bools, floats, integers, the player variables, strings, and so on and so forth. You also have your conditions. So, for example, you can use something similar to if statements, or you can compare the value of a variable, and also you then have your actions, essentially what you would tell your code to do after an event has been triggered. And for example, that can be, we can change the depth of field, we can apply a camera shake, we can set the camera target, or for example, if we go down to toggle, we can toggle something on and off, like the HUD. We can turn it off when the player goes into the water, or something like that. There's lots and lots we can do with this. We can even do some of the more math stuff, like adding and subtracting, and so on and so forth. So, hopefully you should have a good understanding of how Kismet works and the similarities to most common programming languages, in the sense that you have your object-oriented, you've got your object-oriented programming, you've got your event-driven programming, and you've also got your actions and your variables and stuff. If you haven't done any of that stuff before, it's completely fine. I'm going to be going over some of the basics in this episode. So, what we're going to be doing in this episode is going over the Kismet interface. I briefly explained the similarities of how Kismet works next to programming languages and such, and hopefully afterwards we're going to be creating this very intimidating looking script that we have here, but simple at the same time. So let's just start going over the Kismet interface. So if you actually want to open up the Kismet interface, all you gotta do is press the little big green K button at the top here, and it will open just like that. Now, the interface itself is pretty simple. You have your sequences up in this nice lovely box, which you can drag around to move your different nodes around. All you gotta do is click it, press Control, and then drag them. And also you can press Alt to select numerous things and then just drag them along a bit like that. So that's pretty much how it works. We also have a bunch of buttons up here. You don't really need to touch these. We also have the ability to toggle on different elements within the interface. For example, we can turn the properties off, we can turn it on, we can turn the sequences off, you can turn it, and so on and so forth. And lastly, we do have the properties and sequence boxes. So I'm not necessarily going to be showing you what sequences in this episode, as you don't really need to know what it is, and you don't really need to use it in the most basic form. The same with most of these buttons here too. And lastly, we have the properties box, which essentially allows us to manipulate our different nodes inside of here, just like you would if you had, for example, a static mesh actor or a light or something. You can just mess around with the properties. So for example, on this level loaded event, I can change how many times it can be triggered, I can turn it off and on, I can give it comments, and on the matinee I can do things like change the play rate, so how fast it will play, I can loop it, I can do tons and tons of other stuff, and that's kind of how it works. So, let's get into making our very first Kismet script. So, if you didn't get the stuff that I've gone over already in the tutorial, please make sure that you go back and re-watch it until you do understand. And if you still don't understand, make sure you check out some other sort of programming stuff, like with just the programming paradigms and so on. So, let's get into this. So, every single piece of code really needs an event to start it off. Something has got to happen. So those events could be something like the player spawning in the level, and that's something that we can do. So for example, if I just quickly delete that, make sure that doesn't happen, I have this player spawned event, so as soon as the player spawns, something's going to happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell it to play an announcement. This announcement's essentially just a piece of text on the screen. And I'm going to tell it to say, hello world. A very ambiguous phrase, but it should be working nonetheless. So, having said that, with that basic action hooked up to my event, it should go ahead and play it. Also, one thing you do want to note, which I didn't mention there, is that this works just the same in just the same way as the material editor. All you got to do is just hook it up as if you was trying to tell something to do something, like you would hook up a piece of code. The event would happen, and then inside of that event you would then tell it what to do. So just hook up the output of that event into the input of that, and then obviously anything else you might want to happen you can hook up to the output of the play announcement, and it will play in order. So let's test this out and see if it actually works. So I'm going to press play, and it should say hello world, and there we go, we can actually see it is indeed saying hello world. So I'm going to quickly close that, and we're going to move on to something a little more complex now. We're actually going to start creating this script. So I'm going to quickly delete all of this so we can start from the very beginning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this script to say hello world or goodbye world based on a bool. That bool is going to be based on whether or not the player has pressed the button already. So to do that, I'm going to be needing an event. That event is going to be the player pressing a button. So what I'm going to do is use a key button pressed. Now please play around with all the different events here, become familiar with what all of them are, what they do. I cannot go over all of them as there is tons and tons of them, and same with all the other things. So for now we're just going to be using the input, but make sure you do check out these. So I'm going to be using this, and I'm going to try hook this up to this. Sure, you could do that, but it doesn't really work. So, well, it will work, but it's not necessarily going to show off what we want. So I'm just going to break the links here, and I'm going to set this key button pressed to have an input name. That input name is going to be the input button that we want the player to press. So I'm going to set this to A. So when the player presses A now, this event is going to trigger off. At the moment nothing's going to happen because nothing's hooked up to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to be using a variable in the form of a bool. A bool just says true or false, and if they pressed it before, we're going to set that to, if it's, okay, sorry about that, I'm getting a little jumbled up there, but so if they have pressed it before, it's going to be set to true. If they haven't pressed it before, it's going to be set to false, and it hasn't been changed because it's the default value. And we're also going to be using a condition, similar to like an if statement. For example, let's say if we was doing some programming, we would be writing if that bool equals true, then do something. That would be, just basic programming logic, but you kind of should be getting my point. So there is a lot of different variables that we have available to us. I'm not going to be explaining all of them. Go Google them, whatever you got to do. but just the main stuff. String is text, integer is numbers, and bool is true or false. So just the basics of what you need to know for now. So let's go ahead and get this bool of ours in, and it's set to false by default, which is 0, true being 1. So I'm going to set this back to 0, and I'm going to call this has been pressed. And now whenever the player presses it for the first time, we're going to change that to something else. So to do that, we're going to need an action in the form of set variable bool, and then we just tell it to do stuff. But firstly, we need to make sure that we play the announcement before that happens. So we're going to need some sort of condition to check whether or not that has actually happened before. So I'm just going to go ahead and hook this up to pressed. So as soon as the player presses that, it's going to check whether or not the bool is true or false. So let's go ahead and do this. Hook up play announcement to true, and then play announcement to false. And with that being done, when it's false, it's going to say hello world because it's the first time. And if it's the second time, we're going to make it say goodbye world. Or I could probably spell it properly. And there we go. And it will do that. However, after having pressed it for the first time, we now need to change the value of that bool. So let's go ahead and do that. So just as I said earlier, after something's happened, you can hook something else up, just like this, which is pretty simple. And what I need to do now is give the compare bool node something to compare. So let's go ahead and hook up the bool. You don't need to worry about result just yet. You'd use that for setting the value of another bool to something. Just don't worry about it. So now that bool, this compare bool sequence here now knows what it needs to compare. However, it doesn't change yet. So what we need to do is we need to set the target of this bool that we want to change over to this, and then we want to create another variable to tell it what the value is that we want to change it to. So let's go ahead and do this. New variable, and then bool, and I'm going to make sure I set this one to true, which is 1 if you remember correctly. So hopefully this should work. Let's go ahead and press play, and if I remember correctly, the button to trigger it is A. So the first time I press it, it says hello world, and the second time it says goodbye world, just as we intended. And every other time after I say every time I press A after that, it's gonna keep on saying goodbye world. But yeah, that's just some of the basic stuff we can do inside of Kismet. So if you have followed along, make sure that you analyze exactly what you've got here. Keep going back to the programming paradigms and how they work, different variable types. Make sure you check out what each and every one of these do in terms of the variables, the events that you have, and the actions, and you should be able to pick up Kismet pretty quickly. Keep in mind, I'm going to be going over tons and tons of Kismet scripts and stuff in my advanced series, so you can pick it up further. But this should be pretty much everything I need to go over in this tutorial. I am going to be touching up on Kismet a little bit more in the next episode when I go into some matinee stuff similar to this. So thanks for watching, comment, like, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.